The sun hung low over Thunder Valley on that particular summer evening, casting long shadows across the prairie grass that stretched endlessly in all directions like a golden ocean frozen in mid-wave. Smoke curled lazily from a ring of teepees set in a bend by the Crow River, each hide covering painted with symbols that spoke of horses, buffalo, and rivers that once ran free across land, now claimed by treaties written in languages the Lakota did not speak, and signed under duress they could not refuse. Lakota children dressed in beaded buckskin, worn soft by careful hands, and countless washings held one another in a wide circle and danced around a small fire that crackled and popped as the dry wood caught flame. Their laughter was bright enough to scatter the evening shadows that stretched long across the trampled grass, a sound so pure and unguarded it seemed to push back against the weight of history pressing down on this place. The oldest among them, a girl of perhaps 12 summers with long braids decorated with small shells, sang a chant in their mother tongue, her voice rising and falling like the wind that bent the grass in waves. The younger ones followed, stumbling over words they were still learning, words their grandparents had spoken without effort, but which now had to be taught, carefully preserved, like precious seeds against a winter that might never end. They grinned with the pure joy of movement and song, then their small faces flushed with exertion and happiness, oblivious to the struggles that had brought them to this moment. On one side of the circle stood a Lakota warrior named Chayton. He was a man of perhaps 35 summers, lean and weathered by sun and hardship, his skin the color of old copper, lined with scars that told stories he did not often speak aloud. His long black hair, streaked here and there with premature gray, hung loose past his shoulders, occasionally lifting in the breeze. He wore fringed buckskin leggings and a shirt adorned with intricate quill work that had taken his cousin Nita weeks to complete, each tiny colored quill carefully positioned to form patterns that held meaning in the old ways. Atop his head sat a war bonnet of eagle feathers, each feather earned through acts of courage and sacrifice. And they caught the firelight and held it like small flames, making him look both magnificent and haunting in the gathering dusk. In the crook of his left arm rested a baby wrapped in a soft trade blanket, her tiny fist curled against his chest with the instinctive grip of infants everywhere. He swayed gently, rocking her with the unconscious rhythm of someone who had done this many times before. And his dark eyes followed each movement of the older children with a mixture of pride, vigilance, and a deep sadness that never quite left his face anymore. He counted them silently, as he did every evening, making sure each one was accounted for, each one safe for one more day. On a rough bench nearby, fashioned from split logs and smooth just enough to avoid splinters, sat Eliza Ward, a pale immigrant woman, in a plain green dress and bonnet that had faded from too many washings in harsh lye soap and too much exposure to the relentless prairie sun. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, nearly transparent in places, and the hem was permanently stained with prairie dust that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Her hands, resting gently on the infant in her lap, were calloused from hard labor and marked with small scars from kitchen knives, hot stoves, barbed wire, and all the countless small injuries that came from a life of unrelenting work. She was perhaps in her late 20s, though hardship had carved lines around her eyes and mouth that made her look older in certain lights. She cradled another infant in her arms, this one swaddled in linen she had sewn herself with careful even stitches during long evenings by lamplight when sleep would not come. Her gaze followed the dancing children as if she could not quite believe she was allowed to witness such a thing, as if at any moment someone might tell her this was not her place and send her away. There was something fragile about her, still a brittleness around the edges, like a piece of pottery that had been cracked and glued back together, never quite as strong as it once was. But there was also a core of steel that had been forged in fires she would not speak of aloud. A strength that surprised even her when she had cause to draw upon it. Far beyond the camp, carried on the warm wind that bent the grass in long sweeping waves, and brought with it the scent of sage and dust, came a faint whistle. It was the sound of a train approaching the town iron wheels grinding over iron rails with a rhythm that spoke of progress and industry, and a world that did not care what it crushed beneath it in its relentless forward march. The whistle screamed again, sharp and piercing, cutting through the evening air like a knife. And with it came the promise of trouble that would soon rip this fragile piece apart like paper in a storm. But for now, in this moment, suspended between what was and what would be, there was only laughter, firelight, and the soft murmur of a warrior speaking Lakota words to a baby who did not yet know her name or understand the tangled, impossible story of her blood and the choices that had brought her here to this place of refuge and defiance. The story of how they came to this moment began weeks earlier in a very different place, and under circumstances none of them could have imagined would lead to this strange new family. Thunder Valley, in the summer of 1873, crouched at the edge of Lakota land like a stubborn scar on the prairie, a town clawed together from raw timber, desperate ambition, and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that characterized the American frontier in those years following the Civil War. It was a place of false-fronted buildings that promised more than they could deliver, their painted facades, hiding rough-hewn interiors, where deals were struck in whiskey and violence, more often than in law and handshakes. The single dusty main street was lined with the usual establishments, a general store with barrels of flour and bolts of calico in the window, a saloon with swinging doors that were never closed and never quite hung straight, a telegraph office where messages traveled east and west, with a speed that still felt like magic to those who remembered the days of Pony Express riders and handwritten letters that took months to arrive. A blacksmith's forge sent sparks into the air. At all hours, the ring of hammer on anvil, a constant backdrop to the town's other noises. A small church stood at one end of the street, its whitewashed boards already graying from dust and neglect, more a symbol of respectability than a center of genuine faith. A telegraph line buzzed overhead, strung on crooked poles that leaned with the prevailing wind, like drunkards supporting one another, carrying messages that changed lives and fortunes with brief crackling bursts of electricity. At the far end of town, past the last scattered houses, a spur track stretched toward the Copper Creek silver mine, where men dug fortunes from the earth and left behind only broken rock, broken bodies, and the kind of silence that follows when hope has been used up and discarded like empty ore sacks. Eliza Ward lived on a dry little ranch 2 miles outside town, a homestead that consisted of a small house of cracked boards and hard-packed clay, a leaning barn that housed 2 aging horses and a milk cow, and several acres of soil that yielded more dust than crops, no matter how much sweat was poured into it. The house was small, barely 3 rooms with a kitchen that smelled perpetually of wood smoke and old grease. A bedroom with a sagging bed frame whose ropes needed constant tightening, and a front room where Vernon Hale spent his evenings drinking whiskey from a bottle he kept in the cupboard and muttering about debts, disappointments, and the general unfairness of a world that had not recognized his obvious talents. She had come west 3 years prior as a mail-order bride, one of thousands of women who made that journey in those years carrying hope in a carpet bag and a packet of letters that had promised affection, partnership, and a new life, far from the Philadelphia tenement where her entire family had died of fever one brutal winter when she was 17. The letters had been kind, even poetic in places, painting pictures of wide skies and opportunities of a ranch that just needed a woman's touch to thrive, of a man who wanted a partner to build something lasting. The man who met her at the rail station was Vernon Muddy Boots. Hale so called for the perpetual grime on his boots, from trudging between the ranch, the saloon, and whatever business kept him away for days at a time, without explanation. He had been polite enough at first, even kind in a gruff, distracted way, helping her down from the train, commenting favorably on her appearance, taking her trunk without complaint. That had not lasted long. The kindness had evaporated like morning dew once they reached the ranch. And he realized she was a real person with thoughts and needs of her own, not a convenient appliance he had ordered from a catalog. and it had died completely buried under resentment and cruelty the day Dr. Gideon Clark had delivered his careful, apologetic diagnosis. 2 years into their marriage, Eliza had only bruises hidden beneath her long sleeves and high collars, and a silence that had settled over the house like winter frost, heavy and suffocating. Vernon's tenderness, such as it ever was, had died the moment the local physician had gently informed them both, in his quiet office, that scarring from a childhood fever meant Eliza was unlikely ever to carry a child to term. The doctor had been as kind as possible, his voice soft and his manner professional, explaining that the fever had damaged her internally in ways that could not be repaired, that pregnancy was possible, but dangerous and unlikely to result in a living child. He had offered his sympathies, had given them time alone in his office to absorb the news. Vernon had said nothing in the doctor's office, his face going pale, and then slowly flushing red, his hands clenching and unclenching on the arms of the chair. But that night, drunk on whiskey and fury, he had told her exactly what he thought of a wife who could not give him sons to help work the ranch and inherit whatever small legacy he might leave. "You were supposed to give me sons," Vernon muttered whenever whiskey loosened his tongue, which was often enough that Eliza learned to recognize the particular tone that meant he was working himself up to violence or vicious words. "Strong boys to work the land to carry my name. What use is a barren wife? What did I pay for your passage for? I could have bought a mule for less money and gotten more work out of it." Eliza learned quickly to keep her eyes down and her mouth shut, to move quietly through the house, as if trying not to disturb the air itself, scrubbing floors until her knuckles bled and her back screamed in protest, mending fences under the blazing sun, while Vernon rode off on errands he never explained, and which often kept him away for days. She learned which words would set him off, which silences were safe, and which were provocations, how to read his moods in the set of his shoulders and the sound of his boots on the porch. She did not ask questions about where he went or what he did, because asking led to backhanded slaps that left her ears ringing, and nights spent locked in the shed among the tools and spiders while he raged inside the house. What she did not know, could not know in her isolation on the ranch, was that Vernon had found a sideline more profitable than anything the dry soil could provide, a business that required neither rain nor luck, but only a certain coldness of heart and a willingness to see children as commodities rather than human beings. Dr. Gideon Clark knew something was wrong in Thunder Valley, though it took him months to piece together the full picture. He was a man in his early 40s with graying hair and steady hands from years of setting bones and delivering babies, a quiet competence that made people trust him with their bodies and sometimes their secrets. He had come west after the war, carrying his own scars, both visible and invisible, hoping that the vast spaces of the frontier might provide room for ghosts to disperse. He had begun to notice things in his practice that did not sit right, small discrepancies that nagged at him like a persistent itch. Children disappeared from the town rolls with troubling frequency. Families who sent their youngsters to the schoolhouse one week would mention casually, if asked, that the child had been sent east on an apprenticeship or a placement with relatives, that was never fully explained and seemed to happen with suspicious suddenness. The parents, usually poor or desperate, would have a few extra dollars in their pockets and a haunted look in their eyes, and if pressed, they would insist the child was better off, would have opportunities they could never provide. But their voices never quite carried conviction. The local schoolteacher, Margaret Finch, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s with steel-gray hair, pulled back in a severe bun and a mind that missed very little, had started keeping her own private records, marking names that vanished from her classroom rolls with a careful X in her personal ledger. When she brought her concerns to Gideon one afternoon, over tea in her small book-lined parlor, speaking in low tones as if afraid of being overheard, even in her own home, he had frowned into his cup and finally given voice to the suspicion that had been growing in him like a cancer. "Something is wrong," he said quietly, setting down his cup with a careful click against the saucer. Children do not simply vanish like this in functional communities. And I believe Vernon Hale is part of it, possibly at the center of it. What can we do? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands gripping her own teacup so tightly her knuckles showed white. If we accuse him without proof, he will destroy us. He has friends in the territorial office connections we cannot match. And if we are wrong— We are not wrong, Gideon interrupted gently. But you are right that we need proof. Real evidence, not just suspicions and a list of missing children. We need to know where they are going and why. What neither Gideon nor Margaret yet understood was the full scope of the operation Vernon had built or how deeply the rot had spread. The mine owner, Sebastian Cole, was a thin, hollow-eyed man who looked like something that had crawled out of the earth and forgotten to wash his skin, pallid and waxy from years spent underground. His eyes sunk deep in his skull, like those of a corpse not quite ready to lie down. He needed workers who could fit into the narrow shafts where silver veins ran close and dangerous places where the rock pressed in so tight that grown men could barely squeeze through, where timbers creaked ominously and the air grew foul with bad gases that could kill a man before he even knew he was in danger. Adult miners demanded wages that cut into profits, complained when the timbers cracked and the air grew bad, organized themselves into unions that made demands about safety and working hours. They had the bad habit, from Cole's perspective, of expecting to be treated like human beings rather than disposable tools. Children, on the other hand, could be had for almost nothing. Orphans off the eastbound trains, arriving confused and frightened in a territory that might as well be another planet. Half-starved local youngsters whose parents were desperate enough or vicious enough to sign papers they could not read. Even stolen Lakota children from the resettlement camps taken during the forced placements that were supposed to educate and civilize them, but often served other, darker purposes. All of them could be funneled into the mine, worked until their small bodies gave out, and if they died, which many did from cave-ins, from bad air, from exhaustion and despair, and they could be buried quietly in unmarked graves behind the processing shed, where no one who cared would ever find them. Their names could be scratched from ledgers as if they had never existed. It was brutally efficient, profitable, and utterly evil in its cold calculation. Vernon supplied the children, using his position as a moderately respectable rancher to travel freely to meet the trains, to negotiate with desperate parents and corrupt officials. Cole paid him well money that Vernon spent on whiskey and gambling, and the kinds of entertainments available in towns where no one asked questions. The law, such as it was in that time and place, looked the other way, because men like Cole contributed generously to the campaigns of territorial politicians, and men like Vernon knew how to keep their mouths shut and their business quiet. A day's ride north of Thunder Valley, beyond the ranches and the telegraph lines and the invisible boundaries that white men had drawn on maps, but which meant nothing to the land itself. Chayton led a small Lakota band camped by a bend in the Crow River, where cottonwoods grew thick and the water ran clear enough to catch fish and see the stones on the bottom. It was good land, the kind his people had once traveled freely across, following the buffalo herds in their seasonal migrations and the turning of the seasons in patterns established over generations beyond counting. Now it was land they held by sufferance and stubbornness, squeezed between the territorial boundaries that kept shrinking and the encroaching homesteads that appeared like mushrooms after rain. Always one broken promise away from being forced onto the reservation at Black Mesa, where the government claimed they would be fed and protected, but where in reality they would be controlled and diminished until nothing remained of who they had been. Chayton was a man shaped by loss and defiance in equal measure. War and broken treaties had taken much from him, carving away pieces of his life with the relentless efficiency of water wearing down stone. His parents had died during the forced march to the reservation 5 winters back, succumbing to cold and hunger on a trail that came to be known by a name the whites did not speak and the Lakota could not forget. His younger sister, bright and beloved, had died in childbirth the year after bleeding out in a teepee, while a white doctor in town refused to come because she was Indian and had no money to pay his fees. What remained were 12 children, and they were the reason he fought and the reason he refused to go quietly to the reservation and disappear. Some were his by blood, the sons and daughters of his first wife, who had died of the coughing sickness that swept through the camps when the buffalo were gone, and the treaty rations promised by the government never came or arrived, spoiled and insufficient. Others he had taken in after raids and relocations, children left orphaned when soldiers burned villages or when families were scattered by starvation and despair. His widowed cousin Nita, a woman in her 40s with graying braids and a sharp tongue that hid a fierce protective love, helped him keep them fed and clothed. She tanned hides, taught the girls to bead sewed clothing from trade cloth and buckskin, and made sure the younger ones did not wander too close to the river when the current ran swift. It was a fragile existence held together by stubbornness and hope that was more defiant than optimistic. When soldiers came one bright morning in late summer and seized 3 Lakota children during a forced placement, loading them onto a wagon bound for the rail line in Thunder Valley, Chayton did not wait for permission from the elders. The children were siblings whose mother had died the previous winter. The oldest boy, a lanky youth of perhaps 12, had fought the soldiers kicking and biting until one of them struck him across the face with a rifle butt hard enough to split his lip. Chayton, watching from the cottonwoods, felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. He took 2 riders, young men named Lakota and Hinto, who were quick and loyal, mounted his fastest pony, and tracked the wagon south toward Thunder Valley. He was determined to pull those children back before they disappeared into the east on one of the orphan trains, or under the mountain at Copper Creek, where no one would hear them cry and no one would care if they lived or died. The orphan train shuddered to a halt at the Thunder Valley rail siding with a shriek of brakes that set every dog in town barking. Steam billowed from the engine in great white clouds, and the smell of coal smoke and hot metal settled over everything. Dust rose in choking clouds as people moved on the platform. Eliza stood by Vernon's wagon, unloading sacks of grain he had insisted she bring to town, her back aching from the weight and the jolting ride. She was not supposed to be paying attention to the train or the crowd, but she could not help herself. There was something in the air today, a tension that made her skin prickle. A conductor with a tired face and a clipboard began herding children down from the third-class cars, lining them up with practiced efficiency. They wore ragged coats and thin shoes, and their eyes were wide with fear or dull with resignation. Some were white, some darker-skinned, and a few were clearly Lakota taken from the camps and mixed in with the rest. Vernon Hale stood near the freight shed, talking in low tones with Sebastian Cole. Vernon wore a decent coat and a clean hat, playing the part of a respectable rancher. Cole looked like something that had crawled out of the earth and forgotten to wash. They spoke quietly, and after a moment Vernon counted out several bills into Cole's hand. Eliza heard a small cough behind her and turned. A Lakota boy, perhaps 8 years old, with solemn dark eyes, crouched behind a freight crate. His wrists were bound with rough twine that had rubbed the skin raw, and his cheeks were streaked with dust and dried tears. His eyes met hers, and in that brief connection, she saw terror and desperate hope. "What are you doing with them?" The words came out before she could stop them, louder than intended. She pointed toward the children being led away. "Those are children, not animals." Vernon's face darkened. He grabbed her arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "They are work," he hissed. "The mine pays good money for young hands, better than letting them starve." "They are children," Eliza repeated, her voice shaking. "They should be in school, not in mines." "They are business," Vernon snapped. "And you will keep your mouth shut if you want a roof over your head, unless you want to walk home or spend a few days locked in the shed." The train whistle screamed again, piercing and sharp. A second wagon rattled forward across the platform. The driver cracked his whip over the lead horse's ears, and the animal, already nervous, shied violently sideways, slamming into a slurry cart loaded with coal dust and water. The cart tipped with a groan, and black muck sloshed across the platform, spattering everyone. Chaos erupted instantly. Men shouted and cursed, horses reared, children scattered. The conductor waved his clipboard and yelled for order, but in the noise and confusion, his authority meant nothing. Coal dust hung in the air like dark fog, and in the midst of all that chaos, 3 Lakota riders moved with swift purpose along the far edge of the yard. Chayton and his companions had been watching for hours, waiting for the right moment. They wore no war bonnets, only plain shirts and breechclouts. As the horses reared and men scrambled, Chayton kicked his pony forward along the blind side of the wagon, using steam and dust as cover. Lakota slashed the lead team's traces with his knife. Another rider loosed spare ponies, adding to the confusion. While the driver fought his suddenly freed team, Eliza saw the Lakota boy stumble near the wagon wheel. The driver raised his whip and brought it down toward the boy's shoulders. Without thinking, Eliza lunged forward and yanked the boy clear, pulling him against her skirts and shielding him with her body. The whip cracked past her ear, and the driver reached down to grab her. An arrow suddenly appeared and buried itself in the wooden rail beside the driver's hand, so close the fletching brushed his knuckles. He jerked back with a yelp. Chayton guided his pony through the dust and leaned down, one hand extended toward Eliza. "With me?" he said in accented but clear English. "Now, there is no time." Behind them, gunmen fumbled for rifles, but the confusion made it impossible to get clear shots. Vernon stood on the boardwalk, his face purple with fury, his eyes locked on Eliza with a promise of retribution. She looked at the boy, clinging to her skirts. She realized that if she stepped back now, she would be helping to send him into darkness he might never escape. She would be complicit. The choice was not really a choice at all. She grabbed the boy, lifted him with desperate strength, and swung him up toward Chayton. The warrior caught the child and steadied him. Then he extended his hand again toward Eliza. She took it, planted her boot on the pony's flank, and hauled herself up behind the boy. Her skirts tangled, her bonnet slipped, but she locked her arms around the child and held on. Chayton kicked the pony into a gallop, and they shot out of the rail yard through a side alley, hooves clattering. Gunshots cracked behind them, bullets whining off buildings, but by the time the air cleared, they were gone, disappearing into the prairie beyond. Vernon rallied a posse within the hour. He had the law on his side, or at least the appearance of it. Several men who owed him favors or feared him saddled up without asking questions. They mounted with rifles, fresh horses, and grim determination. Chayton, Eliza, the rescued boy, and the 2 Lakota riders pushed their ponies hard across the prairie, racing north toward the Crow River. The land stretched endlessly, grass rippling like water, broken only by low swales and scrub that offered little cover. The sun beat down brutally. Behind them, bullets began kicking up dirt near the pony's hooves. One round splintered the end of Chayton's bow. He did not waste breath, only veered left and right, using every dip in the land to break the posse's line of fire, weaving unpredictably. They reached the Crow River in late afternoon. The water ran high and fast, fed by recent mountain rains, churning white around stones. Chayton did not slow. He plunged his pony straight into the water, and the river rose up like a living thing. The current slammed against the horse's chest with shocking force. Water cold, even in summer, rose higher than anticipated, reaching the pony's shoulders. Eliza's skirts soaked through in seconds, the heavy fabric becoming waterlogged and dragging at her like grasping hands. The added weight threw off her precarious balance, and she felt herself sliding sideways, the cold water rising to her ribs and chest. The boy clung to her waist, fingers digging in and shaking violently. Water splashed into her face, making her gasp and choke. For a terrifying moment, she could not tell which way was up, could not breathe, could only hold the child and hope. She started to slip further, her boot losing purchase entirely. The current pulled inexorably. Panic flared bright and hot. She thought with strange clarity that this was how she would die, drowned far from home, while trying to save a child she did not know. Then Chaitin's hand clamped around her thigh, and the pony's mane simultaneously, his grip like iron, strong enough to hurt and strong enough to hold. She felt the solid heat of his back as he leaned into her, using his body as an anchor, shifting his weight with minute precision to balance all three of them against the river's fury. "Lean forward," he commanded, barely audible over the water, but carrying absolute authority. "Against me. Press the boy between us. Keep his head above water." Eliza did as he said, abandoning modesty and pressing forward, sandwiching the boy between her body and Chaitin's back, feeling muscle flex and strain as the warrior fought the river. The pony staggered, nearly went down, and then found purchase on a submerged rock and lunged forward with desperate strength. Step by agonizing step they fought across. The far bank rose before them, muddy and steep, and the pony scrambled up with effort that nearly unseated them all. They made it, water streaming from them, and moments later, the other riders emerged. On the far bank, the posse pulled up short. Horses danced nervously at the water's edge. Vernon sat at the front pointing and shouting, but none of the men were willing to risk that crossing with the water so high and arrows waiting on the other side. After a long shouted argument, the posse turned and began riding slowly back toward town, Vernon's fury evident even from a distance. They had won this round, but everyone knew it was not over. Chaitin led them to the Lakota camp as the sun set, painting the sky in deep purples and reds. The camp was a small cluster of perhaps 8 teepees in a protective bend of the river, hidden by cottonwoods. Smoke rose from cooking fires, carrying the smell of roasting meat that made Eliza's stomach clench with hunger. As they rode in, children erupted from between the teepees, running toward them with shouts that shifted from alarm to joy when they recognized the riders and saw the rescued boy. A girl of perhaps 10, thin and fierce, reached them first and pulled the boy from the pony with desperate strength, holding him tightly while tears streamed down her face, and she spoke rapidly in Lakota. This was his sister, and the reunion made Eliza's own eyes burn. Eliza slid from the pony slowly, legs shaking from exhaustion and fear's aftermath. Her dress clung sodden, her hair hung in wet tangles. She stood unsteadily, acutely aware that she did not belong here, that she was an outsider, where outsiders were rarely welcome. Lakota men and women emerged and gathered to stare at her faces, showing curiosity, suspicion, hostility, or careful blankness. An older woman with graying braids and a face carved by weather stepped forward. This was Nita. She spoke to Chaitin in rapid Lakota, her tone sharp and questioning, gesturing toward Eliza. Chaitin answered quietly, explaining what had happened. Eliza caught her own name and a few words. White woman, helped, train. But most of the conversation was lost. Finally, Nita turned to Eliza, switching to halting, heavily accented English. "You help?" she asked, each word carefully formed. "Yes," Eliza said hoarsely. "Why?" The question was blunt, demanding truth. Eliza looked at the children gathering around at the boy, now laughing with his sister despite tears. "Because no one should be sold." She said simply, the words coming from deep conviction. Not for money, not for labor, not for anything. They are children, not property. The elders murmured among themselves in low tones. Some looked skeptical, others thoughtful, a few openly hostile. Harboring a white woman could bring soldiers, but Chaitin spoke again, his voice carrying earned respect. And after a long moment, the eldest man gestured toward the central fire in a way that seemed to grant temporary permission. That night, sitting by flames wrapped in a borrowed trade blanket, because her dress was still damp, Eliza glimpsed a world she had never imagined. Teepees glowed from within, lit by small fires casting dancing shadows. Meat hung on drying racks, curing for winter. Children played with a freedom that seemed almost alien to someone who had grown up in cramped tenements and then lived in fear. Women worked with their hands, fingers moving with practiced speed as they beaded intricate patterns onto moccasins and shirts, creating beauty through patience and artistry. Men spoke in low tones around other fires, repairing weapons and checking horses, their movements economical and purposeful. It was a life held together by communal effort, by shared purpose, by interdependence. And despite everything, the exhaustion, the fear, the knowledge that she had destroyed whatever fragile life she had, with Vernon, Eliza felt something crack open inside her chest, a shell she had built around her heart to survive. She felt for the first time in years the possibility of something more than mere survival. She felt hope fragile and terrifying, but real. The first days in camp were difficult. The Lakota watched Eliza, constantly assessing whether she was threat or ally. She could not speak their language beyond a handful of words, and her presence was a constant reminder of the people who had stolen their land and killed their families. Children stared at her with open curiosity or wariness. Some of the older women refused to speak to her at all, turning their backs when she approached. But Eliza found ways to make herself useful. When a small girl fell and scraped her knee badly on a sharp rock, Eliza cleaned the wound with boiled water and wrapped it in clean cloth torn from her petticoat, using the basic medical knowledge she had learned from necessity over hard years. When one of the younger boys developed a fever, she sat with him through the night, cooling his forehead with water-soaked rags and encouraging him to drink when Nita brought herbal tea. She worked without being asked, gathering firewood, hauling water from the river, helping to process a deer that hunters brought in, dirty work that made her hands smell of blood and animal musk, but which needed doing. She learned by watching, by asking through gestures when words failed, by making mistakes and trying again. Slowly, grudgingly, the band began to accept her presence. Nita, observing her quiet persistence and genuine care for the children, began teaching her Lakota words, repeating them patiently until Eliza could form the unfamiliar sounds. The children, less burdened by history and suspicion than their elders, began to warm to her, especially when they realized she would play with them, tell them stories in English, which the older ones would translate, and share what little she had. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Eliza sat outside Nita's teepee, mending a torn shirt for one of the boys, when she noticed a pale infant sleeping nearby in a cradle board. The baby had fair hair and delicate features that marked her as white, and Eliza felt a pang of curiosity mixed with sorrow. How had this child come to be here? She was on train. Nita said, noticing Eliza's attention. Her English was improving with practice. Chayton take her when he take others. She have no one. No family want her. Eliza looked at the sleeping infant and felt something twist in her chest. A baby unwanted and discarded, saved by people who had every reason to hate her kind. She reached out and gently adjusted the blanket covering the child, and the baby stirred but did not wake. Meanwhile, back in Thunder Valley, Vernon had sent his telegram to the military post at Black Mesa, framing himself as a victim, and the Lakota as raiders. But he also knew that military action would take time, and his business could not afford long interruption. He met with Sebastian Cole in the back room of the saloon, both men drinking whiskey and plotting their response. "We need those children coming in regularly." Cole said, his voice as dry and lifeless as old paper. "The mine cannot operate at capacity without them. And now we have this problem with the doctor and the school teacher. They are asking too many questions." Vernon nodded, swirling whiskey in his glass. Gideon Clark and that Finch woman. They have been poking around talking to families, looking at records. They are building something. Can you handle them? Cole asked. I can handle anyone, Vernon said with more confidence than he felt. But we need to be careful. If they get real evidence, if they take it to the territorial marshal, then we make sure they do not get evidence, Cole interrupted. Or we make sure they cannot deliver it. The threat hung in the air between them, ugly and clear. Dr. Gideon Clark and Margaret Finch, unaware of the specific danger, but sensing the general threat, moved carefully. They met only in private, speaking, in low voices, sharing information they had gathered separately. Margaret had been compiling her list of missing children, cross-referencing it with orphan train arrival records she had quietly obtained from the conductor who stopped in Thunder Valley. The pattern was undeniable. Far more children arrived than were officially placed with families. Where are the rest going? She asked Gideon one evening in his office, after hours, the curtains drawn against watching eyes. The mine, Gideon said grimly. It has to be the mine. Cole needs small workers for the narrow shafts, and Vernon is supplying them. But we need proof. We need documents, witnesses, something that cannot be dismissed or ignored. Cole keeps records, Margaret said thoughtfully. He is a meticulous man, for all his faults. Every operation at the mine is documented for the investors back east. There must be ledgers, payroll records, something that shows children being paid or at least accounted for. Those records would be kept at the mine office, Gideon said, which means one of us would have to go there and look. They sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the danger of what they were considering. Finally, Margaret spoke. I will do it. A woman searching through papers might be dismissed as confused or lost if caught. A man would be shot as a thief or spy. Margaret. I am the logical choice, she interrupted firmly. You are too well known to Cole, and you have a medical practice to run. If something happens to you, people will notice immediately. I am just a school teacher, and I am tired of watching children disappear while I do nothing. 3 nights later, when the moon was dark and clouds obscured the stars, Margaret Finch rode out toward Copper Creek Mine. She left her horse tied in a grove of cottonwoods a quarter-mile from the mine buildings and approached on foot wearing dark clothing and moving with the caution of someone who understood that discovery might mean death. The mine office was a small structure separate from the main processing sheds, built of rough lumber, with a single window and a door that was locked, but whose lock was old and simple. Margaret had come prepared with a thin blade she used to spring the mechanism, a trick she had learned years ago from a brother who had not always walked on the right side of the law. Inside, the office smelled of paper, ink, and tobacco smoke. A single desk dominated the room, covered with papers and ledgers. Margaret lit a small candle she had brought, shielding the flame with her hand, and began searching quickly but methodically. She found payroll records or shipment manifests, equipment purchases, and then, in a locked drawer, she jimmied open with her blade, she found what she was looking for. A separate ledger kept in Vernon Hale's distinctive handwriting that recorded the delivery of units to various shafts in the mine. Each entry included a date, a number of units, an age range, and a price paid. There were no names, but the cold arithmetic made clear what was happening. Children were being purchased and allocated to the most dangerous parts of the mine, like equipment or livestock. Margaret's hands shook as she read. Some entries had annotations: Unit 7 shaft, C, collapsed, timber loss. Unit 3 shaft, a bad air loss. The casual notation of deaths reduced to accounting language made her stomach churn. She could not take the ledger, its absence would be noticed immediately, but she could copy key pages. She worked quickly, her handwriting cramped and urgent, transferring dates, numbers, prices, and Vernon's damning annotations onto sheets of paper she had brought. She was nearly finished when she heard voices outside. Margaret froze, candle flame guttering. Two men were approaching the office, their voices carrying clearly in the night air. One was unmistakably Sebastian Cole, his dry rasp distinctive. The other she did not recognize. "Need to accelerate the schedule," Cole was saying. "The next train arrives in 4 days. I want at least 8 units from it, preferably 10 if the quality is acceptable." "Vernon says there might be complications," the other man replied. "Something about his wife running off with Indian soldiers getting involved." "Vernon's domestic problems are his own concern," Cole said coldly. "As long as he delivers the merchandise, I do not care if his wife ran off to China. We have investors who expect returns, and I will not disappoint them because a rancher cannot control his household." They were at the door now. Margaret had perhaps seconds before they would enter and discover her. She blew out the candle, shoved the copied papers inside her shirt, and moved to the window. It was small, but she was not a large woman. She pushed it open as quietly as she could and squeezed through, dropping to the ground outside just as she heard the key turning in the lock. She pressed herself flat against the building's wall, barely breathing as light spilled from the office, and she heard the men enter. Her heart hammered so hard she thought they must hear it. But they were focused on whatever business had brought them there, and after a moment she was able to slip away into the darkness, moving carefully until she reached her horse. She rode back to Thunder Valley, with her copied pages pressed against her skin under her shirt, every shadow seeming to hide pursuers, every sound making her jump. But she made it home without incident. And the next morning, she and Gideon studied the copies together in his office. "This is it," Gideon said quietly, his face pale with anger and vindication both. "This is the evidence we need. We can take this to the territorial marshal. We can end this." "Not yet," Margaret said. "Look at the dates. There is another shipment coming in 4 days. If we move now, Cole and Vernon will be arrested, yes. But those children on the train will still disappear into the system somewhere. We need to intercept them first. We need to save them and bring down the operation simultaneously." Gideon considered this. "You are right. But we cannot do this alone. We need help. We need the Lakota," Margaret finished. "We need Chayton and his people. They have as much stake in this as we do. More." Getting a message to the Lakota camp was not simple. They could not simply ride out there. Vernon had men watching the trails, and any obvious contact with the band would expose their intentions. But Gideon remembered treating a Lakota boy 2 months earlier, a child with a broken arm who had come to his office in the night with his mother. He had set the arm and charged nothing, and the mother had given him a small leather pouch as thanks, telling him through halting English and gestures that if he ever needed help from her people, he should leave the pouch at a certain lightning-struck tree north of town. It was a tenuous thread, but it was all they had. Gideon rode out that evening and left the pouch at the tree, along with a carefully written note explaining what they had learned and proposing a plan. Then he rode home and waited. 2 days later, as Gideon was closing his office for the evening, Chayton stepped out of the shadows by the back door. Gideon startled, but recovered quickly. "You got my message?" Chayton nodded. "Your plan is dangerous, for all of us." "Yes," Gideon agreed. "But it is the only way I can see to stop this. If we merely report what we know, the men responsible might face justice eventually, but the system will continue elsewhere. If we can rescue the children and provide undeniable evidence simultaneously, we can destroy both the operation and the men behind it." "You would risk your life for children who are not your blood?" Chayton asked, his dark eyes studying Gideon intently. "Would you not?" Gideon countered. Chayton smiled slightly, a brief expression that did not reach his eyes. "I already have. That is why Eliza is in my camp instead of her husband's house. Very well. We will help. But I have conditions. They talked long into the night, working out the details of what would become the ambush at Snakebite Ford, each man bringing his own knowledge and resources to the plan. When Chayton finally slipped back into the darkness, Gideon felt both relief and dread. They were committed now. There was no turning back. At the Lakota camp, Chayton explained the plan to his people and to Eliza, who had been learning their language and their ways with surprising speed, driven by necessity and genuine desire to understand. When she learned what they were planning an ambush to intercept the wagon carrying the next shipment of children, she insisted on being part of it. "You have done enough," Chayton told her in the careful English he spoke with her, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "You risked yourself once. That is more than most of your people would do. Those children need more than rescue," Eliza replied firmly. "They need someone who can speak to the white authorities, someone who can testify to what Vernon and Cole are doing. Your word will not carry the same weight as mine, however unjust that is. You know this." Chayton studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You have changed since the train," he said. "You are not the frightened woman who pulled that boy from the wheel." "I am still frightened," Eliza admitted. "But I have learned that fear is not the same as powerlessness. You taught me that you and your people. Now let me help finish what we started." The ambush at Snakebite Ford was planned for 2 days hence, when the next shipment of children would be transported from Thunder Valley to Copper Creek. The ford was a natural choke point where the trail narrowed and wagons had to slow to navigate the rocky crossing. It was also remote enough that the sounds of confrontation would not easily carry to either town or mine. On the day itself, they assembled before dawn. Chayton and 5 of his warriors, Eliza Gideon, dressed in a borrowed coat that made him look official Margaret, who insisted she would not be left behind, and young Hinto, who had been assigned to hold the horses in case quick retreat was necessary. They positioned themselves carefully using the rocks and scrub along the trail to conceal their presence and settled in to wait. The wait was long and tense. The sun rose higher, turning the morning cool into midday heat. Flies buzzed, horses stamped and switched their tails. Every sound seemed magnified, every moment stretched. Eliza found herself praying silently, not to any particular god, but simply casting her hope and fear out into the universe, asking whatever powers might listen to, let them succeed to let the children be saved. Finally, in early afternoon, they heard the rattle and creak of an approaching wagon. Gideon stepped out into the trail as planned, holding up his hand in the universal gesture for stop. He wore his best coat and carried a leather satchel that made him look official authoritative. The wagon pulled up driven by 2 rough-looking men with rifles across their laps and tobacco-stained beards. In the back, visible through gaps in the canvas cover, were 6 children, 4 white, 2 Lakota, all thin and frightened. "What is this about?" The driver demanded, one hand moving to his rifle. "Dr. Gideon Clark, Territorial Health Inspector." Gideon said with impressive calm, producing a folded paper from his satchel, one of the forgeries Margaret had carefully prepared. "There has been an outbreak of smallpox in the mining camps upriver. I am under orders to examine all persons passing through this district to prevent spread of the contagion." The mention of smallpox got the men's attention. Pox was a nightmare on the frontier, capable of wiping out entire communities. The driver exchanged glances with his companion. "Nobody told us about any pox outbreak?" "It was only confirmed yesterday," Gideon replied smoothly. "Oh, the territorial health officer sent riders out last night to all crossing points. If you proceed without inspection and those children are carrying the disease, you will be held personally responsible for any deaths that result, including your own." The men muttered to each other, clearly uncomfortable. While they argued over the papers and debated what to do, Chayton and Lakota moved silently through the brush to the rear of the wagon. Working quickly, they cut the ropes holding the canvas cover in place and whispered urgently to the children inside, in both Lakota and broken English. "Help is here. When we tell you run to the rocks, do not look back." They managed to get 4 children out, 2 Lakota, 1 white girl, 1 white boy, when disaster struck. The second guard, a sharp-eyed man with a scar across his cheek, stood up on the wagon's seat to peer back and check on the cargo. He saw Chayton's hand withdrawing through the gap in the canvas and shouted in alarm. Everything happened at once. The driver grabbed for his rifle. Gideon dropped the pretense and pulled a small pistol from his coat. Margaret, hidden in the rocks, fired a rifle over the men's heads as a warning. The 2 remaining children in the wagon screamed. The horses, spooked by the gunfire, reared and plunged. Chayton shouted for the freed children to run as he and Lakota melted back into the brush. The driver got his rifle up and fired the shot, going wild but forcing everyone to duck. The guard with the scar whipped the horses violently, and the panicked animals lunged forward, the wagon careening toward the ford at dangerous speed. Nita, positioned further up the trail with her own rifle, fired at the wagon's wheels, trying to stop it, but the rough movement made it nearly impossible to aim. One of her shots killed the lead horse instead, and the animal collapsed in the traces, causing the wagon to flip sideways with a crash of splintering wood. The 2 remaining children were thrown clear, but one, the smaller of the 2, landed badly and did not get up. The driver and guard tumbled from the wreckage, both bruised and bloodied, but functional. They abandoned the wagon and the children, mounting the surviving horses and fleeing at a gallop back toward Thunder Valley, choosing escape over confrontation with unseen enemies. In the chaos and dust, the rescued children were gathered up. The small one, who had fallen hard, a Lakota girl of perhaps 6, was unconscious with a bleeding gash on her forehead. Gideon examined her quickly, his practiced hands checking for broken bones and signs of internal injury. "She is alive but hurt. We need to get her somewhere I can treat her properly." But they had bigger problems. The wagon driver had escaped, and he would report what happened. Cole and Vernon would know their operation had been deliberately targeted, would know that someone was organizing resistance. The fragile time they had to build their case was evaporating. "We need that ledger," Margaret said urgently. "The one Vernon keeps at the mine. Without it, we only have the copies I made, and a good lawyer might argue those were forged. We need the original to prove the case beyond doubt." "Then we take it," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We go to the mine and take it." "That is suicide," Chayton said flatly. "The mine will be guarded now. Cole will expect retaliation." "Not if we go tonight," Eliza countered, "before they can organize while they are still trying to understand what happened here. We have surprise for perhaps 12 more hours. After that, Vernon and Cole will fortify, and we will never get near that office again." They argued, but ultimately Eliza's logic was sound. That evening, a small group rode toward Copper Creek: Chayton, Eliza, Gideon, Lakota, and Margaret, who refused to be left behind. The injured Lakota girl and the other rescued children were left at the camp under Nita's fierce protection. They reached the mine after dark, approaching from the back side through a ravine that Chayton knew from previous scouting. The mine operated around the clock, but the night shift was smaller and focused on the actual mining rather than security. The office building stood dark and apparently empty. "I will go in," Eliza said quietly. "If I am caught, I can claim I came looking for Vernon, that I am his wife returning home. They might believe that long enough for the rest of you to escape." "And if they do not believe you?" Chayton asked. "Then you leave anyway," Eliza replied. "You get those children to safety, and you bring the copies of the ledger to the marshal. My testimony is not as important as theirs." Before anyone could argue further, Eliza moved toward the office, using shadows and the noise of the mine operation to mask her approach. The door was locked, but she had watched Margaret pick the lock before and tried to replicate the technique with a thin piece of metal she had prepared. It took several agonizing minutes of fumbling before the mechanism clicked. Inside the office was as Margaret had described it. Eliza lit no candle working by feel and the faint moonlight through the window. She found the desk, found the locked drawer, and used brute force rather than finesse, prying it open with her metal piece and not caring about the noise. The ledger was there, exactly where Margaret had said its leather binding distinctive, even in darkness. She grabbed it and turned to leave, and found Sebastian Cole standing in the doorway blocking her exit, a pistol in his hand. "Mrs. Hale," Cole said, his voice dry and empty. "How unexpected. I had heard you ran off with savages. Yet here you are stealing from my office. I suppose Vernon will want you back. Damaged goods are better than no goods at all. That ledger is evidence of murder." Eliza said, her voice shaking, but her grip on the book tight. "Children have died in your mine. You will answer for that." "I will answer to my investors," Cole replied, "who care only about returns. As for the children, they were purchased fairly and worked as contracted. What happened to them afterward is merely the inevitable wastage of labor. Now put down the book and come with me." "No." Cole raised the pistol, aiming directly at her. "I said put down the book." An arrow suddenly punched through the window and took Cole in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fired reflexively, the shot going wide, and Eliza ran. She crashed out the door as Chayton materialized from the shadows, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward where the horses waited. Behind them, shouts rose as guards responded to the gunshot. They ran through the darkness, boots pounding dirt, lungs burning. Bullets cracked past them. One of the horses was hit and went down screaming. But they made it to the ravine, made it to where Gideon and the others waited with their mounts, and they rode hard into the night, with the ledger clutched against Eliza's chest and the sounds of pursuit fading behind them. They had the evidence, but they had also provoked open war. The next morning, back at the Lakota camp, they gathered to assess what they had and plan their next move. The ledger sat on a blanket near the fire, its pages open to show Vernon's damning handwriting and cold calculations. Eliza sat holding the pale infant she had noticed before, rocking her gently while the others talked strategy. Chayton was speaking with Gideon and Margaret about how to approach the territorial marshal when they heard a horse approaching fast. Everyone tensed, reaching for weapons. But the rider who appeared was not a threat, and it was a woman middle-aged and heavy-set, her face streaked with tears and dust. She slid from the horse clumsily and nearly fell. Gideon recognized her immediately. "Bessie, what are you doing here?" Bessie was the midwife from Thunder Valley, a woman who attended most of the births in the area and kept the kind of secrets that midwives have always kept. She looked terrified, her eyes darting around the camp as if she expected soldiers to emerge from the trees. "I had to come," she gasped, her voice breaking. I cannot carry this anymore. It is eating me alive." "Carry what?" Gideon asked, gently guiding her to sit near the fire. "What happened?" Bessie's eyes fixed on the baby in Eliza's arms, and her face crumpled. "That child," she whispered. "That baby. I know her. I brought her into this world, and then oh, Lord, forgive me, I put her on the train." Eliza felt the world tilt. "What are you talking about?" Bessie sobbed, the words pouring out in a torrent of guilt and confession. 8 months ago, Vernon Hale came to me. He had gotten a girl in trouble, a young scullery maid at the boarding house. Just 16 years old, hardly more than a child herself. She was terrified, had nowhere to go. Vernon wanted nothing to do with her. He said she was trying to trap him, ruin his reputation. The camp had gone silent, everyone listening with growing horror. The girl came to my house to birth the baby. Bessie continued, her voice shaking. It was a hard labor. She bled badly. I did everything I could, but she died in my bed holding that baby girl just once before her eyes closed. And Vernon, her voice broke. Vernon came the next morning with $50. $50 in gold. He told me to get rid of the child. Put her on the orphan train, make sure she went far away, where no one would connect her to him. He said if I did not do it, if I told anyone, he would ruin me. He would say I killed the mother through negligence. And I believed him. Eliza stared at the baby in her arms, at the fair hair and delicate features, and saw for the first time the resemblance to Vernon in the shape of the nose, the set of the small chin. Her stomach churned with a mixture of rage and disgust, so intense she thought she might be sick. So I did it. Bessie whispered, tears streaming down her face. I wrapped her in a blanket, and I put her on the eastbound train, with a note saying she was an orphan with no family. I told myself I was giving her a chance at a better life, that some family somewhere would take her in and love her. But I knew where those children really went. I had heard the rumors, seen the families who took money to send their youngsters away. And I did it anyway because I was a coward, because I was afraid of Vernon. Chayton, who had been standing rigid and silent throughout the confession, finally spoke. His voice was colder than Eliza had ever heard it. This man sold his own child, his own blood. He tried to have her worked to death in a mine, or sent away to die among strangers, all to protect his reputation and save $50. I am so sorry, Bessie sobbed. When I heard that Lakota raiders had taken children from the train, when Vernon started raging about it, I wondered. And then, when I saw Mrs. Hale had gone with them, I thought I prayed maybe the baby had been saved. And then today, I heard Vernon and Cole planning something terrible, planning to attack your camp, and I could not. I had to warn you. I had to tell the truth. Eliza looked down at the baby girl, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, completely unaware of the evil that had marked her from her first breath. This child who Vernon had discarded like trash, who Chayton had risked everything to save, was the living proof of Vernon's depravity. He will pay, Eliza said quietly, but her voice carried a steel that made everyone look at her. Vernon will pay for every child he has hurt, for this girl's mother, for all of it. I swear it. Chayton met her eyes across the fire, and in that moment, understanding passed between them. This was personal now, in a way it had not been before. This was not just about stopping a trafficking operation. This was about destroying a man who was capable of such coldness, such calculation, such absolute absence of humanity. He is planning to attack us. Chayton said, his voice flat. When soon, Bessie said. Within days. He has hired men, promised them gold from the mine. Cole is providing weapons. They mean to kill you all and take the children back. They think if they eliminate the witnesses, if they destroy your band, they can claim you were raiders and savages, and the law will support them. Then we do not wait for them to come to us, Chayton said. We move first. But they did not get the chance. The attack came 2 days later at dawn, when the mist rose from the river and made the world seem wrapped in cotton. Vernon and Cole had hired every desperate man they could find, offering gold for violence, promising no questions asked. They hit the Lakota camp hard riding, in shooting, setting tippies ablaze with torches, creating chaos and terror. The camp erupted in screaming confusion. Women grabbed children and ran for the river. Men reached for weapons, but the attackers had surprise and numbers. Chayton emerged from his teepee, already moving bow in hand, and saw immediately that this was not a raid to intimidate, but an attack meant to destroy. His son Fala, 15 summers old, and already showing the promise of the warrior he might become, was helping younger children escape. Chaitin saw him push 3 small ones toward the willows, shouting for them to hide. A raider on horseback swung around, rifle raised. Fala turned to face him, placing his thin body between the man and the fleeing children. Chaitin opened his mouth to shout to call his son back to do something. But he was too far away, the chaos too thick. The rifle cracked. Fala jerked backward and fell, clutching his chest. "No." The word ripped from Chaitin's throat as he ran, but he already knew. He reached his son and dropped to his knees, hands pressing the wound, but the blood came too fast. Fala's eyes were wide, staring at the sky turning gold with sunrise. His lips moved, forming words Chaitin could not hear over the sounds of battle. Then his eyes went distant and still. Something broke inside Chaitin in that moment, something that could not be repaired. He laid his son's body gently in the grass and stood. The grief was so intense it wrapped around and became something colder, harder. He moved through the camp like death itself, bows singing arrows, finding throats and hearts with mechanical precision. He felt nothing but the need to stop these men, to protect the children still living, to make the attack stop. Eliza, emerging from Nita's teepee, where she had been sleeping with the infant, saw the bodies and the burning and Fala lying still. She understood immediately what had happened and what it meant. She ran to where Chaitin stood over 3 dead raiders, his chest heaving, blood on his hands. "Chaitin," she said, knowing words were inadequate, but needing to say them anyway. "I am so sorry." He looked at her, and his eyes were empty. "They will pay," he said in English, each word precisely formed. "All of them. Cole, Vernon, every man who profits from stolen children. They will pay in blood." "Yes," Eliza agreed. "But not like this. Not in rage. We end this properly. We use the law and the evidence, and we destroy them so completely they can never hurt another child. That is how we honor Fala. That is how we make his death mean something." Chaitin stared at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face, the cold fury banking, but not extinguishing. He nodded once curtly. The raiders retreated, having taken casualties they had not expected from what they thought would be an easy target. They had captured 3 children in the chaos, dragging them away on horseback, but they had lost 5 men and accomplished nothing except murder and destruction. The camp that had been vibrant with life was now a smoking ruin. 2 elders dead, Fala dead, and 3 children taken. The survivors gathered around Chaitin, looking to him for guidance. Nita, her face carved from stone, began organizing the evacuation of those who could not fight. "The non-combatants go north to Red Cloud's camp." Chaitin said, his voice empty of emotion, but clear in command. "We will do what must be done." That evening, those who remained planned the assault on Copper Creek Mine. It was a desperate plan, suicidal perhaps, but they all knew that if they did not act now, if they let this continue, the cycle would never end. Cole would hire more men, Vernon would supply more children, and the mine would keep swallowing young lives until someone stopped it with force. "We cannot match them in a straight fight," Gideon said, studying the crude map he had drawn of the mine layout. "They will have guards now, probably armed better than us." "Then we do not fight straight," Chaitin said. "We use deception. We make them think we are attacking from one direction while we strike from another, and we turn their own violence against them." They refined the plan through the night, each person contributing knowledge and skills. When dawn broke, they rode toward Copper Creek, with grim purpose, knowing that some of them might not return, but that the children who were suffering in those shafts deserved people willing to risk everything. The mine crouched at the end of its canyon like a predator in its den. Smoke rose from the smelting operations. The sound of hammering and the creak of ore carts echoed off the rock walls. Guards patrolled the perimeter more than usual, nervous after the botched raid. The assault team approached as planned, disguised as a legitimate supply convoy. Gideon drove the wagon wearing a coat that made him look official. In the back, hidden under tarps and grain sacks, were Chayton, Lakota, Eliza, and Margaret. Nita and 3 other warriors circled around to approach from the back side of the canyon where the waste rock was dumped. At the gate, guards stopped them. "What is your business?" "Dr. Clark, Territorial Health Service," Gideon said with impressive calm. "I have orders to inspect the workers. There have been reports of lung disease spreading from this mine. If it reaches the town, there will be quarantine and closure." The threat of quarantine of economic loss made the guards hesitate. One went to fetch the foreman, while the other watched the wagon suspiciously. Long minutes passed. Finally, the foreman arrived, a thick-necked man with tobacco juice staining his beard. "Let me see your papers," he demanded. Gideon produced the forged documents Margaret had prepared. The foreman studied them, frowning. Behind him through the gate, Eliza could see children moving in the shadows, thin figures covered in rock dust, carrying loads far too heavy for their size. "These papers look," the foreman began. Chayton gave a sharp whistle. The tarps exploded as the hidden fighters burst from the wagon. At the same moment, Nita and her warriors emerged from the waste rock area, firing arrows into the air as a signal. The guards shouted and reached for weapons, but surprise gave the attackers crucial seconds. Chaos erupted. Chayton tackled the foreman, knife flashing. Gideon whipped the horses forward, crashing the wagon through the partially open gate. Eliza jumped down, screaming for the children to run to hide to get clear. Some did bolting like startled deer. Others froze, too frightened or broken to react. Guards fired rifles. Lakota went down with a bullet in his leg, but kept moving, drawing a knife and stabbing the man who had shot him. Margaret grabbed a child, a small white girl, and dragged her toward the wagon. Gideon clubbed a guard with the butt of a rifle he had taken from the wagon seat. Through the confusion, Eliza saw Sebastian Cole emerge from the mine office, a pistol in his good hand, his wounded shoulder bandaged from their previous encounter. He saw her, and his face twisted with fury. He raised the pistol and fired. The bullet cracked past her ear close enough that she felt the heat. Chayton appeared between them, moving with lethal grace, an arrow nocked. "Put it down," he said in English, his voice cold and final. Cole laughed, a dry sound like bones rattling. "You think you have won. You think stealing some brats and making noise will change anything. There are a dozen operations like this across the territory. You are fighting the tide." "Maybe," Chayton said, "but it does not start here anymore, and you do not profit from it." He released the arrow. It took Cole in the chest, punching through and dropping him where he stood. The mine owner fell without another sound, and the pistol clattered from his lifeless hand. Vernon appeared, then limping from an old injury rage, distorting his features into something barely human. He saw Eliza and the baby she had brought with her, the pale infant who was his own daughter, though he had tried to erase her existence. His face went from rage to something even darker, a kind of manic fury that made him seem possessed. "You ruined everything," Vernon screamed at Eliza, spittle flying from his lips. "You worthless, barren witch. You destroyed my business, you turned everyone against me, and now you dare stand there, holding—" He stopped staring at the baby, and something clicked in his eyes. That child should be dead. She should be gone. She is nothing but evidence of my mistakes. He had a bundle of dynamite in his hands, several sticks bound together with twine, and as Eliza watched in horror, He struck a match against his belt and lit the fuse. The orange spark began racing toward the explosives. "If I cannot have this," Vernon shouted, "none of us will." He drew back his arm to throw the dynamite toward the main support timbers at the mine entrance, where several children and fighters were struggling to get people out. The bundle arced through the air fuse, sparking death promised in its trajectory. Eliza did not think. She thrust the baby into Margaret's arms, ran forward, and caught the dynamite bundle before it hit the ground. The fuse was short, burning fast toward her fingers. She had perhaps 3 seconds. Without hesitation, she turned and threw it as hard as she could toward the waste rock area on the far side of the canyon, away from people using every ounce of strength in her body. The bundle tumbled through the air, trailing smoke, and exploded against the rock wall with a deafening roar. The blast sent rock fragments flying and shook the ground, but the main supports held and no one was in the blast radius. Vernon stood staring, his face slack with disbelief that his final atrocity had failed. Then his expression twisted into pure hatred, and he charged directly at Eliza's hands, reaching for her throat like claws. "You should have died," he screamed. "You should have stayed quiet and obedient like a proper wife. This is all your fault." He slammed into her with his full weight, and they both went down. Vernon's hands found her throat and squeezed his face inches from hers, contorted with rage. "I should have killed you years ago," he hissed. "Useless, barren, disobedient." Eliza's vision started to go dark. She clawed at his hands, but he was stronger, fueled by madness. Then her groping fingers found a rock, a piece of debris from the explosion, jagged and heavy. She swung it with desperate strength and caught Vernon on the side of the head. He jerked back, stunned, his grip loosening. Eliza sucked in a gasping breath and hit him again, harder. Blood ran down Vernon's face, and he staggered backward off balance. "No." Eliza said, her voice hoarse but clear. "I am done being afraid of you. I am done letting you hurt people. You end here." She pushed herself to her feet, still holding the rock, and Vernon backed away from her for the first time in their marriage. He backed toward the edge of the loading platform where ore carts ran on rails up from the mine shaft. His foot caught on a rail, and he stumbled, arms windmilling. "Eliza," he started to say, and then his weight carried him backward over the edge. The fall was not far, perhaps 10 feet, but Vernon landed badly. His head struck the iron wheel of an ore cart with a sickening crack that echoed across the canyon. He lay still, blood pooling beneath his skull, his eyes open but unseeing. Eliza stood at the edge of the platform, chest heaving, looking down at the man who had controlled her life through fear and violence, and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief, not even relief. Just emptiness. Chayton appeared at her side, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "It is over," he said quietly. "He cannot hurt anyone now." The fighting was over. The surviving guards had fled or surrendered. The mine was silent except for the sobbing of freed children and the moans of wounded. Gideon moved among them, doing what he could with the limited supplies he had. Margaret gathered the children, counting them, trying to determine who needed immediate medical attention. Eliza stood in the middle of the destroyed mine yard, covered in dust and blood that was not all her own, and felt something shift inside her. They had done it. Against all odds, against law and custom and power, they had done it. But the cost had been terrible. Fala was dead. Dakota was wounded, perhaps crippled. The Lakota camp was destroyed. And though Vernon was dead and Cole was dead, the system that had enabled them still existed, waiting for the next cruel men to exploit it. 3 days later, Margaret and Gideon returned with the territorial marshal and a company of soldiers. They had ridden straight to the capital, bypassing the local military post that might be compromised, and presented their evidence directly to the territorial governor, the ledger, the copied records, the testimony of freed children. Bessie's confession about Vernon's daughter, and the bodies at the mine as final proof. The marshal, a lean man named Caldwell, with gray hair and tired eyes, surveyed the scene with professional detachment. He interviewed witnesses, examined the ledger, spoke with the children. Vernon's body was taken for burial, though few attended the service. Coal's investors back east scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. "This is going to cause a scandal," Caldwell said to Gideon. "Men in the territorial government took money from coal. Investors will demand investigations. It will be ugly." "Good," Gideon replied. "Let it be ugly. Let everyone see what was happening here. Maybe then it will not happen somewhere else." The question of the children remained. By law, they were wards of the territory, now subject to placement in orphanages or with families willing to take them. But the system that had failed them once was unlikely to serve them better the second time. Eliza, sitting with a small group of the rescued children while their wounds were tended, made a decision. She stood and approached the marshal. "These children need guardians," she said clearly. "People who will care for them properly, who will not sell them or use them. I volunteer. I will take legal responsibility for them." Caldwell looked at her skeptically. "You were married, Mrs. Hale. Your husband is dead now, which simplifies matters legally. But you are a single woman with no property and no income. The court will question your ability to provide for so many children." "Then let me help," Gideon said, stepping forward. "I will petition for guardianship as well. Mrs. Hale and I can serve as co-guardians, pooling our resources and ensuring the children have both proper care and legal protection." Caldwell considered this. "That might work, Dr. Clark. You are unmarried, a man of good standing in the community, and you have demonstrated clear commitment to these children's welfare. And Mrs. Hale?" He looked at Eliza with something like respect. "You stood between these children and death multiple times. That counts for something. I will recommend to Judge Harlan that you be appointed joint legal guardians." "What about the Lakota children?" Chayton asked through Bessie, who had agreed to serve as translator and was trying to make amends for her previous silence. "Some of these children are my people. They should not be forced into white schools or white homes." Caldwell sighed. "That is complicated," he admitted at last. "Men in offices back east say any Indian child taken from a camp ought to be shipped off to faraway boarding schools, taught English, taught our ways. That is what the papers say is proper. Even children who were kidnapped and enslaved," Gideon asked pointedly, "even when returning them to their people is clearly in their best interest." "The law is not always sensible," Caldwell admitted. "But given the extraordinary circumstances, I believe Judge Harlan might be persuaded to allow the Lakota children to remain with their band under the general guardianship structure with Dr. Clark and Mrs. Hale, serving as legal representatives to ensure their welfare is protected under territorial law. It was an imperfect solution, a legal fiction that satisfied no one entirely, but which created space for the children to be cared for by people who actually cared about them." 2 weeks later, in a makeshift courtroom in Thunder Valley, Judge Harlan made it official. The guardianship was granted with specific provisions that several of the children would live with the Lakota band, while others would stay with Dr. Clark and Mrs. Hale in Thunder Valley, all under joint legal responsibility. It set a precedent that would be cited in other cases for years to come. That evening, at the rebuilt camp by the Crow River, they gathered around the fire as the sun set. 12 children, some Lakota and some white, sat in a circle. Nita was teaching a small girl to bead. A boy was practicing with a bow under the guidance of one of the warriors. Others simply played their laughter carrying across the prairie. Chayton stood at the edge of the circle, the pale infant Vernon's daughter, whom they had named Wikekpi, meaning star, because she had been lost in darkness and then found sleeping peacefully in his arms. Eliza sat on a bench, another infant in her lap, watching the children with an expression of fierce protective joy. Her dress was mended but still showed the stains of their battles. Her hands were rough, her face lined, but there was a light in her eyes that had not been there before. Chayton walked over and sat beside her, adjusting the baby in his arms. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the children play. "I thought the world meant to take every child from me," Chayton said quietly in English, his accent thick, but his words clear. "Fala is gone. I see his face in the fire. But these 12 still run and laugh. They need someone who will not trade them for money or land." "They have you," Eliza said softly. "They have me for hunting and fighting, for teaching them to survive," Chayton replied. "But they need more. They need stories in both tongues. They need someone who knows the white law and the Lakota way, someone who will stand between them and those who would harm them." He turned to look at her directly. "Come with me. Help me raise them. Not because law says you must, but because you choose to. Let this be your family, if you wish it." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. "I do wish it," she said. More than anything, she stood still holding the baby and stepped into the circle of dancing children. They welcomed her, grabbing her skirts and pulling her along, teaching her the steps of a dance she did not know, but could learn. Chayton stood opposite her in the circle, and their eyes met across the fire. There was no romantic declaration, no passionate embrace. Their bond was built on something deeper and more enduring, shared struggle, shared purpose, and the fierce determination to protect the vulnerable. It was a love earned through action, rather than words proven in blood and sacrifice. As darkness fell completely and stars emerged overhead, the children's voices rose in song, mixing Lakota and English in a harmony that should not work but somehow did. Nita smiled slightly, a rare expression, and added her voice. Gideon and Margaret, who had stayed for the evening, sat at the edge of the circle and watched with satisfaction. This was not the ending any of them had imagined. It was messy, imperfect, held together by legal fictions and sheer stubborn will. The children bore scars, physical and emotional, that would never fully heal. Fala would never come back. The Lakota faced an uncertain future pressed on all sides by a civilization that wanted their land and their children, but not their humanity. But here, in this moment, 12 children laughed and danced around a fire cared for by people who had chosen them, who had fought for them, who would continue to fight for them as long as breath remained. Here, blood had been proven less important than choice, and family had been defined not by law or custom, but by love made manifest in protection and sacrifice. Eliza looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched humanity struggle and survive for millennia, indifferent and eternal. She thought of the girl she had been arriving in Thunder Valley with hope and fear in equal measure. She thought of the woman she had become forged in fire and loss, and the discovery that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. She thought of Vernon's daughter in Chayton's arms, the child who would never know the man who tried to erase her existence, who would instead grow up surrounded by people who had risked everything to save her. She thought of how one choice at a train platform, one moment of seeing a frightened child and refusing to look away, had led to this impossible, beautiful family. "Thank you," she whispered to the night, to the stars, to whatever force had led her from the train platform to this circle of light and life. The fire crackled. The children sang. and the prairie wind carried their voices out across the endless grass, a defiant celebration of survival and hope. And the families we choose when the ones we are born into fail us. In the weeks and months that followed, the story of what happened at Copper Creek spread across the territory and beyond. Other mines were investigated. Other trafficking operations were exposed. The system did not change overnight. Such systems never do, but cracks appeared in its foundations, and through those cracks came light and the possibility of justice. The 12 children grew. Some stayed with the Lakota band, learning the old ways and the new skills needed to survive in a changing world. Others lived in Thunder Valley with Dr. Clark and Mrs. Hale, attending school and learning trades. They moved between both worlds, belonging fully to neither, but welcomed in both, and perhaps that was its own kind of strength. Eliza never married Chayton, not in the eyes of white law or Lakota custom. But they were partners in the truest sense, bound by shared responsibility and mutual respect, raising children together across the divide of culture and history. It was enough. It was more than enough. And on summer evenings, when the work was done and the children gathered around the fire, they would tell the story of how they came to be a family. They would speak of trains and mines, of brave rescues, and terrible losses, of a woman who chose courage over fear, and a warrior who chose mercy over vengeance. They would speak of Fala, whose sacrifice was not forgotten, and of all the children who did not survive to see justice done. They would speak these names into the firelight, keeping memory alive, ensuring that those who died were not erased as their oppressors had intended. And then they would sing, mixing Lakota and English old songs, and new, creating something that had never existed before, but which felt as ancient and enduring as the stars themselves. This was the family they chose. This was the family they built. And this, against all odds and expectations, was home.